Alexei Safronov looked around the gloomy building in front of him. The St. Agatha's Clinic is an old, dilapidated building that seems to have been stuck somewhere in the last century. The windows on the upper floors were barred, the paint on the walls was peeling, and the air around them seemed heavy. He checked the address on his phone again. Everything is right. It was here that he was sent after completing his internship. The first day of work. Alexei tried to banish the strange feeling of anxiety that had come over him even on the way to the clinic. In the lobby, he was met by the chief physician, Dr. Gromov. A tall, gaunt man with graying hair slicked back, and eyes that seemed to look right through. "Welcome, Dr. Safronov," he said without much expression in his voice. "We don't have the easiest place here, but I'm sure you can handle it." Gromov's office looked surprisingly simple. The only thing that caught Alexei's attention was an old black and white photograph of the clinic building. In the picture, it looked new, even majestic. "The clinic has been in existence since 1937. Gromov suddenly spoke up, catching Alexei's eye. "She's been through a lot, but sometimes it seems that this building has a life of its own." Alexei did not understand if he was joking, but decided not to specify. After a short briefing, he was led through the corridors. There was a slight smell of damp and chemicals in the air. The walls were decorated with faded paintings of banal landscapes, but they only made it more disturbing. The patients were quiet. Some just sat staring at the floor. Some muttered to themselves. "The first thing you need to know is that the ventilation in the building is old," said the doctor who showed him around the clinic. "She can make noises at night. It is okay." Alexei nodded as one of the patients caught his attention. He was an elderly man with gray hair sticking out in all directions and strangely bright eyes. He was sitting in a corner with his head in his hands, whispering something. "This is Stepanov, an old paranoid," said the colleague who escorted him. "Don't pay any attention." But passing by, Alexei heard the words of the patient. "Ventilation is breathing. Do you hear? She's calling." Alexei slowed his pace, intending to ask something, but he was hurried. "Come on, don't stay too long." In the evening, after finishing his shift, Alexei settled into his room. It was small, with a dim lamp on the ceiling and an old wardrobe. The only window looked out onto an abandoned courtyard. He tried to relax, but thoughts of the strange whisper wouldn't leave him. Alexei remembered that he had heard something similar earlier in the day. A faint, barely discernible sound, as if someone was whispering in the corner of the room. "Old ventilation," he repeated his colleague's words and grinned. That night, he was awakened by a sound. At first, it was a quiet rasp, as if someone was dragging claws on metal. Alexei sat up in bed, listening intently. Then the sound got louder, and a whisper was added. "Alexei." The words are barely discernible, but obvious. My heart started pounding. Alexei got up and turned on the light, but the sound disappeared. The silence was echoing and frightening. He walked over to the ventilation grate, feeling stupid. Looking inside, he saw only darkness. The next morning, Alexei asked one of his colleagues. He yawned and said, "It's just ventilation. Everyone gets used to it here." But Alexei noticed how he averted his eyes after saying that. When he was on his way to the next round, patient Stepanov suddenly rushed to him and whispered, almost growling, "Doctor, she's calling for you. Don't go there at night. Don't go." And although Alexei tried to write it off as the patient's delirium, fear had already firmly settled in his mind. During the day, Alexei tried to focus on his work, but the feeling of anxiety would not let go. The clinic's patients, at first glance sluggish and indifferent, began to behave more and more strangely. After lunch, a woman in her 50s with a haunted look suddenly abruptly got out of bed and screamed, "He's looking at me!" straight out of the tube. Her scream was so shrill that Alexei involuntarily stepped back. "I heard him laughing last night." The nurse, who was already used to such outbursts, tried to calm the woman, but she struggled and continued to scream until she was taken to a separate room. Alexei asked what was wrong with her, but they answered him briefly. "Paranoid nonsense. Don't pay any attention." However, this happened again in the evening. There were screams in the north wing, and Alexei hurried there. Stepanov again. He was standing in the corner of his room, pressed against the wall. "It's here. It's watching." His voice was hoarse, and his eyes darted around the room like those of a hunted animal. Alexei tried to talk to him, but the man suddenly grabbed his arm. His fingers were icy and tenacious. "Doctor, you heard that, didn't you? That whisper. It comes at night. Always at night. I could hear it moving. Its claws tapping on the iron. Ventilation is his home. Don't look for him if you want to live." The words sounded crazy, but deep down Alexei felt a pang of fear. Everything the patient was saying was too much like his own feelings. Later, in the residence room, he told one of the nurses about the incident. She just waved it off. "Everyone has their own cockroaches here. The building is old. The ventilation is noisy, so they fantasize. Don't take this seriously." But her face betrayed the tension. Alexei noticed how she avoided looking at the ventilation grate behind his back. He woke up again that night. The sounds were louder this time. A whisper, as if someone was calling him. And there was a rasp like claws sliding on metal. Alexei sat on the bed, listening, until he realized that the whispers were coming directly from the ventilation. He turned on the light and came closer. The rust on the grate seemed to him a little darker than it had been before. Alexei pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and illuminated the air vent. There was a glimpse of something shiny in the depths. For a second he thought he saw eyes. A pair of black, moist eyes that stared straight at him. Alexei staggered back and dropped the phone. At that moment, the lights in the room flickered, and the whisper was replaced by a loud metallic thud, as if someone had forcefully hit the ventilation from the inside. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In silence, Alexei picked up the phone, turned off the flashlight with trembling hands, and looked at the ventilation grate again. It was empty. The next morning, he got up with a heavy head. The whole staff was excited. The nurse who was on duty at night is missing. She was last seen at the exit of the chief physician's office. Alexei remembered what he had imagined at night. He felt uneasy, but he didn't dare share it with his colleagues. At the end of the day, passing by Stepanov's room, he heard again, "Doctor, you have to let me out. It's a dead place. He's coming for you. They always come for the new ones." Alexei asked, trying to remain calm. "Who are they?" Stepanov whispered. A whisper. "It's him. Ventilation is breathing. And now she's calling you." The next night, Alexei could not sleep for a long time. He lay on the bed, listening to the building come to life. Thuds and a faint metallic screech could be heard through the walls again, stronger than usual, and it only increased the anxiety. The clock on the bedside table showed 2 a.m. when he heard a whisper. Faint, barely audible, as if the voice was making its way through the thick air. "Al! Hey!" He sat up in bed, feeling a chill creep up his spine. "Alexei!" The screeching of metal became louder. Alexei, trying not to make any noise, got up and went to the ventilation grate. The bars of the metal grate were bent, as if someone was trying to break it from the inside. He leaned closer. It was dark inside the mine. Deep, thick, like a black cloth. But there, in the depths, something was moving. Alexei froze, trying to examine it, and then the whisper was replaced by a hoarse, almost animal growl. A sharp blow on the ventilation grate made him stagger back. The metal bent, as if something huge and incredibly heavy was pressing down on it. Alexei retreated to the bed, dropping the phone. The light in the room began to blink. There was a sound like claws scratching metal, and the sound was getting closer. A whisper filled the entire space around them. You hear. Us." The voices blended into a single eerie cacophony. Alexei, suppressing his panic with difficulty, grabbed his jacket and ran out of the room. The hallway was empty. Somewhere in the distance, a groan was heard, followed by a scream that ended abruptly. He hurried to the resident's office, but it was empty. The doors to Stepanov's room were open. Alexei went inside, hoping that the old man would be able to explain what was going on. "He's coming, doctor," Stepanov whispered, sitting in the corner of his room and rocking from side to side. "You opened the doors, and now he knows you." "Who's he?" Alexei felt that he was losing his composure. Stepanov raised his head. His face was gray, and his eyes were clouded. The one in the vent. He's always been here. He takes away those who don't hear. And you can hear, right? He will pick you up last. Alexei stepped back. The old man began to rock again, whispering something unintelligible. When he left the room, the hallway seemed longer than usual. The light above his head was blinking, and every step echoed. Alexei suddenly noticed that the ventilation grills on both sides of the corridor were broken. He saw footprints on one of the air vents, 3 deep scratches. There was a noise somewhere ahead. It sounded like a crunch, as if someone was breaking large bones. Alexei took a step forward, but immediately stopped. A shadow flew out from around the corner. Something huge and black, with glittering eyes, flashed by at the far end of the corridor. Alexei pressed himself against the wall, trying not to make a sound. He saw the creature disappear around the next bend, but the whisper remained. It was coming from everywhere now. Go ahead. Here. The doctor. He rushed back to his room without thinking about anything. Alexei closed the door behind him and pressed himself against it, breathing heavily. The silence returned, but not for long. The screeching sound came again, this time right outside his door. The night was endless. Alexei was sitting on the floor, pressed against the door. The rattling outside the walls gradually subsided, but the feeling that he was being watched did not disappear. He was afraid to take an extra step, afraid to breathe louder than necessary. When the first ray of dawn broke through the darkness, Alexei felt a faint sense of relief. The morning brought some peace, but only until he found out that another person was missing. Another nurse did not come on shift. Her bag was found next to the chief physician's office, but the woman herself was nowhere to be found. The head doctor only frowned when Alexei tried to ask about the incident. People don't come to these places for a career, Dr. Safronov, he said coldly. Many people lose their nerves. They just leave. They quit. These words, instead of calming down, only increased the anxiety. Alexei decided that he could no longer sit idly by. He had to understand what was hidden in this clinic, otherwise fear would simply devour him from the inside out. There, in those creepy metal ventilation shafts, was the answer. That night, armed with a flashlight and a phone, Alexei went to the technical corridor on the ground floor. The ventilation shafts here were wider and looked even more worn out than in his room. They were cold, mixed with a putrid smell. Alexei turned on the flashlight and pointed it at one of the bars. It was dark inside, but he noticed deep scratches on the walls of the shaft. The metal was twisted, as if something huge had made its way through it. The light of the flashlight caught something strange, a small piece of cloth. Alexei looked closer and realized that it was a piece of clothing. His heart began to beat faster. It was the uniform of the nurse who had disappeared the day before. He removed the grate and climbed inside. The metal tunnel was narrow, but spacious enough for him to move on all fours. Suddenly he heard a sound. It was a faint thud, as if someone was moving somewhere ahead. Alexei froze, trying not to make a sound, but the screeching continued, getting louder. He moved on, shining his flashlight deep into the shaft. Strange symbols appeared on the walls, etched into the metal. They were curved lines, like the writing of some ancient language, unfamiliar and frightening. The smell became stronger. He could feel the bitterness in his throat, as if the stench was getting inside. Alexei moved slowly, trying not to think about what might be ahead. Suddenly, his flashlight illuminated something strange, a large spot of dark, dried blood. And there are prints next to it. They were not footprints or handprints. They looked like paws, only the claws were incredibly long, as if their owner was bigger than any animal he could imagine. The screeching grew louder, and Alexei realized that the sound was getting closer. He tried to turn around, but his movements became convulsive. He heard something huge start moving right behind him. The ventilation shaft trembled, and a low growl sounded from somewhere behind him. Alexei moved forward in horror, faster than before, clinging to the edges of the shaft and barely stifling a scream. He escaped into a wider compartment, one of the main ventilation chambers of the building. There was plenty of room to stand up straight. In the center of the camera, he saw creature. It was huge. Its body seemed fused with metal. The curved limbs resembled spider legs, but they were covered not with fur, but with what looked like equal meat, from which blood oozed. His head was terrible. Dozens of eyes were looking in different directions, and thick black saliva was flowing from a mouth full of knife-sharp teeth. The creature was moving, making soft, hoarse noises. Alexei froze, feeling terror seize him. The monster suddenly raised its head, his eyes fixed on Alexei, and the air was filled with whispers that were louder than ever. Alexei didn't have time to answer, didn't even have time to think. The creature rushed forward, and he, overwhelmed by fear, rushed back, almost losing the flashlight. He ran on all fours through the ventilation shafts, stumbling, falling, feeling the creature chasing him. It wasn't until he got outside that Alexei realized that his entire robe was soaked in blood, and the flashlight was shaking in his hands. The whispers were still far away. The monster didn't chase him any further. He lay low, but Alexei knew that this was not the end. Alexei was sitting in the waiting room, looking at his shaking hands. His body was shaking, his head was spinning, but he couldn't silence the inner voice that screamed at him. He saw more than just a real monster in the ventilation. It's more than that. Evil, ancient, and all-consuming. A nurse came into the resident's room with a gloomy look. It seemed that she was not surprised by Alexei's shocked appearance. "Doctor, another patient has disappeared," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Stepanov. The ward was closed, but he just disappeared." Alexei felt his heart skip a beat. Where could he be? "What is it?" he asked. But he already knew the answer. "Who knows?" The nurse shrugged her shoulders and went out, leaving him alone. The whisper returned to his consciousness, quiet, viscous, as if filling all the cracks of his mind. Ventilation no longer seemed like just a pipe system. Now he knew that it was something alive, teeming with something that a human shouldn't see. That night, Alexei decided that he would stay in the building until the end. He'll be watching, finding out the truth. By midnight, the clinic was silent. The patients were locked up, and the staff seemed to be deliberately avoiding night shifts. Only Alexei remained at his post. He was sitting in the hallway, holding a flashlight in his hands. It was dark all around. Only the occasional lamp was blinking, flooding the space with a faint yellow light. There was a whisper first. It was thin, barely audible, but it was getting louder. Alexei jumped up and turned towards the sound. Shadows flickered through the ventilation grills behind the metal bars, and the air smelled of rot again. The whisper turned into a scream. The patients who remained in their rooms began to scream in unison, their voices merging into a heart-rending scream. Alexei could hear some of them banging on the doors, asking to be let out. A clawed paw emerged from one of the ventilation shafts. Huge, covered in blood and scraps of torn meat, she hit the floor with a dull metallic sound. Then the second one appeared. The creature came out completely, filling the hallway with its eerie presence. His body made wet noises, his eyes burned with a black sheen like coals, and thick saliva dripped from his mouth. Alexei froze, feeling his legs go numb with horror. "You came," he heard the voice in his head again. "I've been waiting for you." The creature approached, bulging dozens of scary, cloudy eyes of various sizes. It raised a clawed paw, and at that moment, Alexei felt his mind start to go out. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was how the shadows caused by the monster filled the entire hallway. They rushed over him, filling him with moans and screams. Alexei woke up at dawn. The body was tangled in a straitjacket. Alexei tried to pull away, but the straps on his arms and legs were held tightly. His eyes darted around, trying to find at least one clue confirming that all this was real. However, the clinic looked ordinary. The walls were the same, the lamps were shining steadily, the ventilation was silent. But the most terrifying thing was that patient Stepanov was standing in front of him, but without a hint of madness. He looked confident and calm, as if he had always been a doctor. "Lena!" His voice was commanding. The patient Safronov again plunged into his delusional fantasies. "Increase the sedative dose. Perhaps this will help him at least take a little break from his own horror." Alexei tried to scream, but only a faint wheeze came out of his throat. The whispers he had heard at night had faded away, but the echoes of it remained inside, as if the St. Agatha's Clinic had now permanently settled in his mind.